I once thought I had married the love of my life, but I was tragically mistaken. Every night, Carol came home late, spinning elaborate tales about work. Deep down, I knew something was off, but I never imagined the extent of the betrayal. Then, one fateful evening, I caught them, my wife and her co-anchor, Honor, wrapped in each other's arms in the green room, believing no one would see. They underestimated me. I recorded everything, the betrayal, the lies, the cold-hearted glances exchanged between them. She didn't care, she was lost in her deceit. But I did care. And now, my revenge was going to be broadcast for the world to see. They would never forget what I was about to unleash. If your wife was out late at 10 p.m., would you worry? I wouldn't, because all I have to do is turn on the local news to see what she's up to. My wife, Carol Martin, is the co-anchor for the nightly news on the top local TV channel here in Birmingham. She's not only stunningly beautiful but also incredibly intelligent. Many people speculate that her next job could be in a major city, perhaps Atlanta or Chicago. There are even whispers of an offer from a station in New York City, which would be a significant opportunity for any news anchor. I'm Tom Bailey, by the way. Carol kept her maiden name professionally, which is common among female newscasters, allowing them to maintain a sense of personal privacy in their careers. I take pride in her success and feel incredibly fortunate to be her husband. We first met while studying at the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa. Carol was focused on broadcasting, while I was delving into marketing. Our paths crossed at a campus event during our freshman year, and I was immediately captivated by her tall figure and radiant personality. I was friendly and approachable, but I wasn't an athlete or the most popular student. Still, we clicked instantly and soon became inseparable. Like any couple, we faced our share of ups and downs. At one point, we broke up for 2 weeks, and I missed her terribly during that time. I rushed back to her dorm, hoping she would forgive me. To my surprise, she came running to me as well. If someone had filmed it, it would have looked like a scene straight out of a movie, with us embracing and promising to be together again. We were genuinely in love. By our senior year, we were engaged. We lived in a cozy apartment off campus but decided to wait until after graduation to tie the knot. Carol dreamed of a beautiful wedding, and her family was more than willing to support that vision. We exchanged vows at Canterbury Chapel on campus just a week after graduation. Carol was fortunate to land her first job as a weekend weather reporter at a TV station in Huntsville. While it wasn't a top position, it marked a significant step in her career, and she made the most of it. Within 6 months, she transitioned to reporting and soon secured a regular reporting role. I found a job at a small advertising agency, balancing work as an account representative and copywriter. It wasn't glamorous, but I gained valuable experience. However, I didn't stay there long. Carol's career was taking off rapidly. By the end of the year, she received an offer for a reporting job at the biggest station in Mobile. Her charm and talent impressed the management, and soon we were packing our bags for the Gulf Coast. I didn't mind being the supportive partner. I knew what I was signing up for the moment Carol began her journey in broadcasting. By the time we moved to Mobile, she was earning more than I was, which was a role reversal I embraced wholeheartedly. Thanks to her connections in Mobile, I found a job at a larger advertising firm in the city. The staff was friendly, and I settled in nicely. Meanwhile, Carol continued to soar in her career. Starting as a reporter, she was promoted to a weekend news anchor when a chance opened up. People loved her, and her ratings soared. Before long, she became the co-anchor for the nightly news. The audience was thrilled when she announced her pregnancy on air, and they followed her journey closely. When our daughter, Susan, was born, it was a widely celebrated event. As Susan grew, the station created a documentary about the challenges of balancing motherhood and work, which even won a regional Emmy Award. Given all of Carol's success, it wasn't surprising when the leading station in Birmingham offered her the co-anchor position. We had become accustomed to our relaxed life in Mobile, so leaving was bittersweet. I had made true friends at work, and saying goodbye was hard, but we believed Birmingham would provide new opportunities for Carol to excel even further. So, we sold our cozy home, packed our lives into boxes, and headed to Birmingham. Some might not see Birmingham as a major city, but with 1.2 million residents, it was a significant move for Carol, especially in her career. I felt nervous about the transition from our comfortable life in Mobile, but I quickly found a job at the second largest ad agency in the city, thanks to glowing recommendations from friends back home and support from the Birmingham station. The move turned out to be much easier than I had anticipated. We quickly settled into our new lives, and I should probably share a bit about our daily routine. Being married to a television newswoman is a unique experience. In the mornings, I would wake up early, make breakfast for myself, and head off to work while Carol and Susan were still asleep. Carol relished those extra hours of sleep, only waking when Susan stirred. After lunch, Carol would take Susan to Mrs. Alsop's house, a kind woman who cared for Susan and a couple of other children alongside her own daughter. With her background in early childhood education, Mrs. Alsop provided a nurturing environment for our little girl, allowing Carol and me to focus on our careers. Despite the challenges of balancing our busy lives, we made it work. I admired Carol's dedication and determination, and I supported her every step of the way. As her career soared, our love seemed to deepen. But little did I know, those late nights and secretive phone calls would soon unravel everything we had built together. The truth hung over our lives like a dark cloud, waiting to burst, and I would soon find out just how fragile our happily ever after truly was. Education was a significant part of my life, especially as I helped Susan learn the basics she needed for school. After work, I would pick her up and bring her home, where I would prepare dinner for both of us and set aside some for Carol to enjoy later. After our meal, I'd give Susan a bath and read her a story until it was time for bed. Then, I'd settle down with a book or watch some TV while waiting for Carol to come home. Sometimes, I'd doze off on the couch, and she'd have to gently wake me up. Once Carol dropped Susan off with Mrs. Olop, she headed to the station, arriving at 3 p.m. to prepare for the evening news. While the national news played on the screen, she would get her makeup done and review her notes before going live at 6 p.m. After the local news, she and her co-anchor, Ted Stevenson, would grab a quick snack since they didn't want to eat too close to airtime. Typically, Carol and Ted alternated for the 10 p.m. news, as only one anchor was needed. But lately, the news director, Don Sanchez, had been keeping them late to review their segments and find ways to enhance the local news broadcasts. I understood why the station focused on ratings. Local news generated significant revenue by retaining all the advertising profits. The more viewers a station attracted, the more they could charge for ad space, resulting in fierce competition for higher ratings. As someone in the advertising field, I got it, but as Carol's husband, I missed spending quality time with her. Our conflicting schedules made it challenging to carve out moments just for us, especially after Susan was born. Weekends used to be our time together, but that had become increasingly difficult since Carol often had to work. With so few opportunities to connect, it felt more like we were housemates than a couple. Our conflicting schedules created a communication barrier, and Carol didn't seem eager to discuss it. It was as if there were no straightforward solutions, and though I felt unsatisfied with how things were, I didn't want to press the issue. I had known what I was signing up for when I married Carol. We had talked about the challenges of being with someone in the spotlight, and I was on board with it. Besides, I had friends dealing with the opposite problem, husbands who were often away from home, missing family time. If I were in their shoes, I would have turned to Carol for support, so I didn't want to be a hypocrite. I reminded myself that Carol was earning more than I was, which made our lives easier, yet money wasn't everything. Eventually, it reached a point where I felt the need to talk to someone about my feelings. One day during lunch, I decided to share everything with Lou Faraday, the media services director at my agency. Lou, who was married and had a little girl close to Susan's age, had become my best friend at work, and I felt comfortable seeking his advice. As Lou spoke about his happiness with his family, I found myself saying, "I wish I had what you have." "It sounds like you're having a tough time," he replied, concern etching his features. "What's bothering you?" That was the moment I opened up about how I felt. I'm married to a popular news anchor, and I feel like I hardly see her, less than her viewers do. Lou listened sympathetically. "That's tough. Can you two take a vacation or a long weekend? I bet your parents would help look after Susan." "I've thought about that," I admitted. "But Carol says Don Sanchez is really pushing them to boost the ratings. They have to be there to maintain their audience." "Look," Lou said, "I've known Don for a while. He's ambitious but also a good person. Maybe you should talk to him and see if he can help you and Carol spend more time together." "I don't know, Lou," I sighed. "I think Carol would be upset if she knew I contacted her boss." "She doesn't have to find out," Lou reassured me. "Don is coming by the office tomorrow to see a pitch for a new video idea we're working on. You know him well enough, I bet you could catch him for a quick chat after the meeting." "I don't want to mess up your pitch," I said. "My personal issues shouldn't interfere with work." "Don't worry about it," Lou replied. "This is just an early meeting. Don wants to see how things are going, and we invited him over. It'll be a good chance for you to talk to him about you and Carol." Though still unsure, I couldn't think of a better plan. That night, my resolve strengthened when Carol came home even later than usual. She didn't wake me when I fell asleep on the couch waiting for her. I awoke late that night to find the TV off and a wet spot on the couch where I'd been resting. Dragging myself upstairs, I changed into my pajamas and slipped into bed next to her without even getting a chance to say goodnight. The next day at the office, I was determined to change the routine we had fallen into. I kept an eye on the conference room where Don was meeting with Lou and his team. When the meeting wrapped up, I peeked in and waved at Don. He looked pleased. "Hey, Tom. How's it going with my favorite news anchor?" he called out. "Hi, Don. Great to see you. Do you have a moment to chat?" I asked. "Of course. What's up?" he replied cheerfully. I decided to keep it light-hearted. "You need to ease up on Carol, she's working too hard," I joked, pretending to frown. Don took me seriously. "Is she unhappy?" he asked, his expression turning more serious. "No, she loves her job," I quickly clarified. "I'm just missing her. We hardly see each other anymore." He relaxed a bit. "Well, you knew her job was busy when you married her," he joked, clearly relieved that she was happy. "That's true," I admitted, "but all those extra appearances and late nights are cutting into our time together." I tried to inject some playful tone into my words. Okay, he replied, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "We might be able to find a balance. I was pushing it a bit on the schedule, but I'd see if I could lighten things up for Carol." There was no need to worry about those after-show meetings, we hadn't had one since the last ratings came out, and our station was doing really well. "Speaking of management," Don continued, "I've got to head to my next meeting. Good to see you. Make sure to keep your wife happy." He gave me a friendly pat on the back and headed out. As I returned to my desk, I couldn't shake off the thoughts from our earlier conversation. I recalled when the last ratings had been released. I checked my computer and saw that it had been a month ago. If Don hadn't held a follow-up meeting in that time, what could possibly be keeping Carol out so late? That thought hit me hard, sending a wave of anxiety through me. What if she was spending time with someone else? As soon as that idea crossed my mind, I knew it was wrong. Carol loved me. Despite the challenges we faced, she wouldn't do anything to jeopardize our marriage. There were plenty of reasonable explanations for her late nights. Maybe she needed to unwind or was catching up on work. So why was I still feeling so uneasy? Just then, Lou popped his head into my office. "Hey, I saw you with Don. Did he help? I'm not sure, I replied, a hint of uncertainty in my voice. I guess I won't know until I talk to Carol. He looked a bit puzzled, but when I didn't say more, he turned to leave. All right, let me know if you need anything, he said as he disappeared down the hallway. The rest of the day felt like a blur. I went through the motions like a zombie, appearing busy to anyone who walked by, but my mind kept circling back to what Don had said. I tried to recall the details of Carol's late nights, and most of all, I worried about what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront her for answers, but another part of me reminded me how foolish I'd look if there turned out to be a simple explanation. Accusing her wouldn't help our relationship. So, I tried to push my fears aside, but another voice in my head called me weak for not standing up for myself. By the time I left work to pick up Susan, I hadn't resolved anything. The only bright spot in my day was the energetic 4-year-old waiting for me. Spending time with her kept my mind occupied for a few hours, but I noticed she was unusually clingy that evening, insisting I keep reading to her. Eventually, she drifted off to sleep, and as I quietly left her room, I looked back at her peaceful face. Tears unexpectedly filled my eyes. How sad it would be if her mommy and daddy were going through a tough time. Feeling worn out, I walked back into the living room and sank into the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I knew I didn't have the energy to argue or confront Carol, so I settled for watching a police show for an hour, though I couldn't remember anything about it afterward. Then the news came on, and I saw my lovely wife talking about the day's events. Watching her smile and speak brought back memories of how I'd fallen for her back in college. Surely this wonderful woman wouldn't let me down. It was well past midnight when I finally heard her car pull into the driveway. She entered from the garage, looking surprised to see me. "Oh, I didn't think you'd still be awake." I stood up from the couch and walked over to her, wrapping her in a warm embrace. "I just wanted to see you. I've missed you." "You're really late tonight," I said, trying to keep my tone light. She responded softly, leaning down to take off her shoes. "Yeah, sorry about that. Don kept us late again for one of his meetings," she said, her voice weary. "I'm really tired, honey. I'm going to head to bed." Without waiting for my response, she turned and walked upstairs. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, my mind racing. Oh no, she just lied to me. Conflicting thoughts filled my head. Maybe she hadn't lied, perhaps Don really did have a meeting. But that didn't make sense, he had told me he hadn't held a meeting in a month. After I brought it up, he wouldn't call one tonight, would he? I didn't want to believe my wife could be unfaithful, but I also didn't want to ignore what could be the truth. What was the truth? When I finally went to bed, Carol was already asleep. I lay down next to her, but sleep was elusive. The next day, I visited Lou's office and asked him to join me for lunch. When he looked up, he saw something on my face and didn't make his usual jokes. "Let's make it a long lunch," I said, sensing his seriousness. He nodded, looking concerned. I picked him up around 11:15, and we headed to a restaurant a few miles away, hoping not to run into anyone we knew. We drove in silence. I wasn't in the mood for chit-chat. Once we sat down and ordered our food, I paused, unsure of where to begin. Lou looked at me with understanding. "It's about Carol, isn't it?" His remark let loose everything I had been holding in. I shared my worries and doubts, and he listened quietly. When I finished, he shook his head. "Wow, I never would have thought. I always thought you and Carol had a great marriage." "Me too," I agreed sadly. "So what are you going to do?" he asked, his simple question cutting through my confusion. I knew I had to take action. "I think I need to go to the station and find out what's happening. If I'm wrong and it's nothing, I can slip out without anyone noticing, and Carol won't know how worried I've been. But if you're right..." "I don't know," I admitted, "but at least I'll know what's really going on. That's better than this confusion." "What about Susan?" he asked, his concern evident. "I've thought about that," I replied. "When we get back, I'll call Mrs. Alsop and see if she can keep Susan a bit longer. She's helped out before, so I hope she can do it again." We finished lunch and headed back to the office. I still felt troubled, but at least I had a plan. Even someone in a tough situation can feel a little better when they finally make a decision. Mrs. Alsop said she could help, but she asked me to be back earlier. "Please be back by 11 o'clock, she told me. "I have things to do in the morning." That didn't leave me much time, but it was the best I could do, so I agreed. After work, I drove to Mrs. Alsop's, my heart racing as I prepared to uncover the truth. I needed to tell Susan about the change in plans. When my little girl saw I wasn't there to pick her up, her expression crumpled with disappointment. But Mrs. Alsop quickly stepped in. "We're having a pizza party, Susan," she announced, and I watched as a smile broke across my daughter's face. After paying Mrs. Alsop for the extra time and contributing for the pizza, I left the room, determined to avoid any further sadness on Susan's part. Now, with a little time on my hands, I needed to find a way to pass it. I headed home and tried to prepare something to eat, but my stomach was in knots, and I ended up tossing the food away. I cleaned the kitchen, hoping that keeping myself busy would help distract me from my worries. The more I thought about my plan, the more anxious I became. The news wouldn't end until 10:30. What could really happen in the next 30 minutes? What if Carol came home before I was able to pick up Susan? The questions circled in my mind, and I felt frozen, overwhelmed by doubt. But then I remembered the determination I had felt during lunch with Lou. I had to do something, even if things didn't turn out as I hoped. I couldn't let this situation drag on. By now, it was almost 10 o'clock. My plan was to get to the station while the news was on, slip in just before it ended, and see what I could find out. Usually, there weren't many people at the station that late, just the engineer, a couple of camera operators, and the sound technician. I hoped it would be quiet enough for me to stay under the radar. When I arrived, however, I was reminded that I had overlooked J.N., the night watchman. He recognized me from previous visits, so getting in was easy, but I still had to sign in, which dashed my hopes of remaining unnoticed. "Good evening, Mr. Bailey," J.N. said with a hint of curiosity. "Here to watch the news?" "Yes, that's right," I replied, signing his logbook. He scrutinized me for a moment, then asked, "Everything all right? No trouble, I hope?" "Oh no, everything's fine," I said too quickly, making my way toward the studio. What did he mean by that? Suddenly, a sinking feeling hit me. Did he know? I approached the set and peeked through the curtains just as the news wrapped up. I spotted Carol removing her microphone and heading toward her dressing room. I hesitated for a moment but decided to follow her. To my surprise, she veered down the hallway toward the green room instead. The green room served as a waiting area for guests before going on air, but there usually weren't any guests during the late-night news. The room was dimly lit, but when Carol opened the door, I noticed one lamp was on, illuminating a man sitting in a chair. The door closed behind them, cutting off both the light and sound. My heart raced. I didn't know what to do. I could go in and confront them, but if it was just a simple meeting, like if Don Sanchez was in there, Carol might be upset with me for barging in. Yet if I stayed outside, I'd never know what was happening. Just then, I remembered a small window on the other side of the room designed for staff to check on guests without interrupting them. Carol had shown it to me during my first tour of the station. I quickly made my way over to the observation window, glancing at my watch. Oh no, it was already 10:45. I needed to hurry to Mrs. Alsop's by 11 o'clock. I crept down the dim hallway, spotting a faint light through the observation window. As I peered in, I could see Carol, dressed in a sleek black outfit, deeply engaged in conversation with a man who was leaning in closely. My stomach dropped as I recognized him, Ted Stevenson, her co-anchor. I pulled out my phone to record the moment. The low light cast a glow on Carol's skin, but the sight of her so close to Ted filled me with unease. I knew I should intervene, but I had to prioritize getting to Susan. I turned back toward the door and glanced at my watch again. It was almost 11 o'clock. I dashed down the hallway and into the lobby, nodding at Joe as I rushed toward the exit. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bailey," he said, but I barely registered his words. "Does everyone know what's happening except me?" I thought bitterly as I hopped into my car and drove fast toward Mrs. Alsop's house. When she let me in, I found Susan already asleep. Wrapping her in a warm blanket, I grabbed her things and turned to leave, thanking Mrs. Alsop for watching over her. She looked at me oddly. "Are you all right, Mr. Bailey?" I stared back in confusion, but then I noticed something. Tears were streaked down my cheeks. "Oh," I said quickly, trying to cover up my emotions. "It's nothing, just some dust." I thanked her again and took Susan to the car, buckling her in while she was still wrapped in her blanket. I don't think she woke up during the drive home. She remained peacefully asleep while I carried her upstairs and tucked her into bed, her face serene, making me long for the days when life felt simpler. I grabbed a drink from the fridge and settled into the dark den, the silence heavy in the air. My mind drifted back to the day my grandmother passed away. The quiet sadness in the chapel felt eerily similar to what I was experiencing now. It was almost 1 a.m. when Carol finally got home. She walked into the kitchen and flicked on the light, her expression shifting from surprise to concern when she saw me sitting there. "Tom? Why are you still up?" she asked, clearly taken aback. "I was waiting for you," I replied, my tone flat. "The guard mentioned you were at the studio. Is everything okay with Susan? Where is she?" "Mrs. Alsop kept her late for me. She's upstairs in bed now." "Well, if you were at the studio, why didn't you come say hi?" I braced myself, knowing this was the moment I'd been dreading. "I did see you tonight," I said, forcing myself to remain calm. "I saw you go into the green room with Ted Stevenson." "Oh right, we just had a quick meeting after the news." I felt my frustration bubbling over. "Carol," I looked through the observation window. I saw more than just a meeting. I even caught a glimpse of that new outfit you've been hiding from me." At least she had the decency to look embarrassed. "Tom, I'm really sorry." My anger flared, and I couldn't hold back. "Are you sorry you did it, or just sorry I caught you?" "Tom, I'm sorry you had to see it like that. I didn't want you to find out this way," Carol said softly, her eyes cast downward as she knelt before me, grasping my hands in a desperate grip. "Are you going to leave me for him?" "Oh, honey, don't even think that," I exclaimed, my heart aching at the mere suggestion. "Of course, I'm not leaving you. This is just a phase, something that will pass. Everything will go back to normal." But as I looked into her eyes, filled with a mix of sadness and defiance, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You mean you're not going to stop? You're going to keep seeing him?" "Sweetheart, it doesn't mean anything," she insisted, shaking her head. "It's just a distraction. With Ted, it won't last. Just let me have this, and I'll be back with you, just like always." I was dumbfounded. "I can't believe this, Carol. You expect me to be okay with this? You two seeing each other whenever you want? How could you think I'd ever accept that?" She stood up, stepping back and crossing her arms, her voice now cold. "Tom, you don't really have a say in this." "Don't have a say?" I repeated, incredulous. "I'm your husband. If you won't stop, I'll have no choice but to file for divorce." Carol looked at me, her calm demeanor only intensifying my frustration. "I don't think that would be in your best interest, Tom." I felt my blood boil. I wanted her to acknowledge the hurt she was causing me, to show some sign of understanding. Instead, she seemed indifferent, almost cold. "Given your choices, I'll determine what's best for me. I won't tolerate this." Tom, listen, she said, her tone condescending. If you file for divorce, you'll be the one losing. You'll lose custody of Susan because the court will favor me. You'll only see her occasionally, maybe on your birthday or during holidays. The house will go to me as well because I'm the primary caretaker. Even without alimony, you'll still be responsible for child support. Wait, I shouted, my heart racing. You're the one who betrayed our trust. Tom, this is a no-fault state, she replied, her voice cold and factual. The court won't consider who did what, it will only look at what's best for the child. Typically, in cases like ours, custody leans toward the mother. She paused, letting her words sink in. If you don't believe me, consult a lawyer. You'll see I'm right. Her tone softened slightly. You don't want this, Tom. Neither do I. I want our family to stay together. What I'm doing doesn't have to change that. Just think about it. I slumped in my chair, feeling utterly defeated. Carol approached me, trying to offer a gentle gesture of affection. Think about it, Tom. I'm going to retire for the night, she said before ascending the stairs. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. I felt lost, uncertain about my next steps. The reality of Carol's betrayal was painful, and the idea that she wanted everything to continue as if nothing had happened felt unimaginable. Eventually, I got up, weary and drained from the evening's discussions, and made my way upstairs. I collapsed into bed, quickly drifting into a restless sleep. Despite my fatigue, my body woke up at 6 a.m. sharp. I showered, dressed, and prepared for the day, moving on autopilot as turbulent thoughts swirled in my mind: run away, confront Carol, take Susan and leave, or simply stay in bed forever. But when I glanced at Susan, sleeping peacefully, I realized I needed to remain composed for her sake. Acting impulsively would only complicate things and jeopardize my relationship with my daughter. I had to stay strong for her. So, I followed my usual morning routine and headed to work. I managed to go through the motions, but once I sat at my desk, my focus eluded me. I rested my head on the desk, lost in thought. Tom? It's Lou. Are you okay? My friend's voice pulled me from my reverie. When I didn't respond, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. What happened? I recounted everything I could remember from the night before, and once I started, the words spilled out uncontrollably. Lou looked stunned, his expression shifting from disbelief to concern. Man, she's got some nerve asking you to accept her behavior, he said, shaking his head. This isn't right. When I finally finished, Lou met my gaze. Tom, Carol has changed. I don't know what caused it, maybe her success, but she's not the same person anymore. You can't assume she's looking out for you. You've got to take care of yourself now. He stood up, determination etched on his face. The first thing you need to do is talk to a lawyer. You can't let her get away with this. You need to find out for yourself what your options are. I don't know any lawyers in Birmingham, I replied, feeling overwhelmed. That's where I come in, he said with a smile. My college roommate became a lawyer, and he practices here. I bet he can see you today if I ask him. Let me make a call. He left my office, and soon returned, holding a piece of paper. You've got to appreciate those old friends, he said happily. You have an appointment at 1 p.m. today. Here's his name and address, he's expecting you. You're a lifesaver, Lou, I said, relief flooding over me. This gives me something to focus on. Anytime, my friend. After your meeting, come back and tell me what he says. The meeting with the lawyer didn't go as well as I had hoped. He greeted me and invited me into his office, asking me to share my story. After I went through the main points, I asked, what are my options regarding the divorce? Tom, he began, leaning back in his chair, it used to be that there was a clear good guy and a bad guy in every separation. The court would listen to both sides argue and assign blame, which made the process difficult for everyone involved. It took up too much time in the court system. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Then someone proposed no-fault divorce. This means, unless a serious crime is involved, the court focuses on dividing shared property and caring for any minor children. It's much simpler. Okay, I said, trying to absorb this new information. But what does that mean for me? He sighed. In simple terms, what Carol told you is likely correct. Unless she's unfit as a parent, like doing drugs or neglecting your daughter, the court will likely grant her custody of Susan. We can try for some visitation, but Susan will live with Carol, and she'll mainly decide how often you see her. Even though Carol makes more money. I felt the weight of his words crash over me like a tidal wave. My thoughts raced, and I fought to maintain my composure. I had to think clearly, for both Susan and myself. Money will still be an issue. You'll need to provide child support, my lawyer said, his voice steady but lacking any warmth. As for the house, he continued, shaking his head, you both own it, so it's considered jointly owned. It will be divided, but the court prioritizes the child's well-being. Most likely, Carol will stay in the house until Susan turns 18. After that, you can sell it and split the profits based on the final settlement. For now, the house is hers. But what if she moves to another city? I protested, frustration creeping into my voice. If that happens, you can sell the house then. But until then, it's her residence. I leaned back in my chair, a wave of anger and helplessness crashing over me. Carol knew exactly what she was doing. I'm sorry, my lawyer said as we shook hands. It's not always fair, but that's how the law works. Driving back to the office, I felt trapped in an inescapable web. I couldn't quite figure out where I had gone wrong, but a gnawing sense of guilt and bitterness settled in my chest. When I returned to the office, Lou was waiting eagerly to hear about my meeting, but one glance at my face told him all he needed to know. How did it go? He asked, concern etched on his brow. It feels so unfair, I replied, pacing back and forth in my office. Carol has me backed into a corner, and I can't change it. She can do whatever she wants, and I'm left here just trying to cope with it all. Lou's eyes widened with alarm. Don't joke like that, Tom, he said quickly. I get that you're frustrated, but we can't go down that road. If anything happened, I wouldn't want to get caught in the middle. I know, I agreed, my frustration boiling over. I would never act like that. It's just hard dealing with her constant presence in my life. As I glanced out the window, my gaze landed on a new billboard across the street, showcasing a large photo of Carol and Ted Stevenson with the bold words, Birmingham's choice for the 6 o'clock news. Look at that, I said to Lou. I can't escape her even here. Lou walked over to get a better look. Uzziah is certainly enjoying the attention those two are getting, he remarked. Then a curious look crossed his face. I wonder how desperate you are to find a way out of this situation? I'm not desperate enough to do anything harmful, I replied sharply, feeling a surge of indignation. Not at all. We're not even thinking about that, but I do have an idea that might help. For the next hour, we brainstormed, bouncing ideas off one another. I told him repeatedly that I thought his idea was crazy and impossible. And if it goes wrong? I reminded him. Carol would retaliate. Through it all, Lou kept insisting, how much worse could it get than it is now? I realized two crucial things. I couldn't endure my current situation much longer, and I had no choice but to consider doing something drastic. Okay, Lou, I'm in, I finally said, even as doubt began to creep in. While driving to Mrs. Alsop's to pick up Susan, I couldn't shake the nagging worry that I was risking losing my daughter. Maybe it would be easier just to accept the situation. As I prepared dinner at home, my mind raced with questions and uncertainty. I decided to turn off the TV. I didn't want to see Susan and Ted together on screen, especially after what I had witnessed just a few nights earlier. While getting Susan ready for bed, I was surprised when I heard Carol's car pull into the driveway. It wasn't her turn to do the news, and I assumed she would be spending the evening with Ted. But here she was, walking in, picking up Susan in her arms, and happily taking her upstairs. I could hear their laughter echoing down the hall as Carol read stories to her. It tugged at my heart, reminding me of the happier times we once shared. When Carol finally came back downstairs, I couldn't help but say, "That was really nice of you. She misses you a lot, especially at bedtime." "I know," she replied, a distant look in her eyes that momentarily gave me hope. Maybe she was reconsidering her choices. But any optimism I had quickly faded as Carol's expression shifted to something more serious. "Tom," she began, taking a deep breath. "I wanted to come home early to talk about next week's plans. I'm taking the week off." Don Sanchez agreed and even encouraged me to take a break. "Our ratings are great, so it's fine." A flicker of hope ignited in me. "Spending a week together might help us fix things," I said. "I'll ask my boss tomorrow, but I think I can manage it." "What do you have in mind?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She sighed, her demeanor growing more serious. "It's not about you, Tom. Ted and I are going away together. We're tired of keeping things a secret. This is our chance to enjoy ourselves." I sat there, speechless, unable to absorb what I was hearing. "You're leaving?" I finally managed to say. "I've arranged for Mrs. Alsop to watch Susan during the day next week. All you need to do is drop her off before work and pick her up like usual." She handed me a piece of paper with the details of where they would be staying, just in case I needed to reach her. "We're leaving Friday. Maybe you could take Susan to the park over the weekend, she loves that. We'll be back the following Sunday, and everything will go back to normal." Carol looked at me, uncertainty flickering in her eyes as she awaited my response. I remained silent, grappling with disbelief and anger. "If you don't have any questions, I'm going to bed early," she said, surprising me by leaning in and offering a gentle gesture of affection. "Thanks for taking care of everything, dear," she said before heading upstairs. As I sat there, I felt a mix of humiliation and rage. This had to be one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. I realized I had to take action to regain my self-respect. Lou's wild idea suddenly seemed like my best option. On Friday, I left work early, determined to confront Carol before she left with Ted. I had already arranged for Mrs. Alsop to take care of Susan overnight. I wanted to shield my daughter from any arguments, so I took steps to avoid that confrontation. Earlier that morning, I had even checked Carol's closet. As I walked into our home, the weight of the impending confrontation pressed down on me. I had no idea what would happen next, but I knew I couldn't sit idly by any longer. The time for action had come. When I saw Carol's suitcases by the door, a knot tightened in my stomach. I knew she would have to return home to pack more, but it felt like a finality I wasn't ready to face. As her car pulled up, I settled into my favorite chair, bracing myself for the conversation ahead. When she opened the door, her eyes scanned the room until they found me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of urgency and surprise. "Is Susan okay?" "She's fine," I reassured her. "She's with Mrs. Olop." "Then why are you here?" she pressed, a hint of frustration creeping into her tone. "I wanted to talk to you about your plans with Ted," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Carol placed her hands on her hips, clearly exasperated. "I've already said I'm going to be with Ted. There's nothing you can do. When I come back, everything will be fine again. Just give me a chance to sort this out." "But Carol," I pleaded, "what about our vows? What about forsaking all others?" She scoffed, shaking her head. "Those vows were made a long time ago. Nobody takes that seriously anymore." "But you'd be cheating," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "I don't want you to break our marriage." "Tom," she said, irritation bubbling beneath the surface, "this conversation is pointless. If I want to be with Ted, I will. This is about me, it doesn't involve you." "What about your viewers?" I pressed. Won't they mind? I don't care what they think, she shot back. They don't matter to me anymore. In 6 months to a year, I'll leave this town for a better job. What people think here doesn't affect me. Please, just listen to me, I said, desperate for her to understand. If you're going to leave, it would be nice to know you care about how it affects me. I need to get packed or I'll be late. If you can't handle seeing Ted when he comes, I suggest you leave. Feeling defeated, I whispered, I'm sorry, Carol. I apologize for everything. I turned and walked out, my heart heavy as I made my way to a nearby bar. I was trembling, desperate for something to calm my nerves. As I sat at the bar nursing my second beer, Lou walked in. Hey, friend, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. How did it go? I'm not sure, Lou, I admitted honestly. It was all too much for me. You'll have to come and see for yourself. Not until I've had one of those, he said firmly, gesturing to my beer. After he finished his drink, we got into my car and drove back to my place. As I expected, Carol was gone. We headed to my office, and Lou plopped down at my computer. When did you get this thing? He asked, his curiosity piqued. But it didn't take him long to figure it out. Okay, he said, waving me over. Let's check it out. With a click, Carol's image appeared on the screen. We listened as she dismissed my attempts to talk about our marriage and excitedly shared her plans with Ted. Wow, Lou muttered quietly, clearly shocked. Then we watched as she gushed about her fans and the city where she worked. Lou's face brightened. We've got her, man. This is better than we hoped for. When the video ended, Lou pressed another button, and we saw Carol again from a different angle. The second camera is important, Lou explained. It makes it feel more real. After that video finished, he arranged to save both files to his office and pulled out a thumb drive for a backup copy. Just in case, he said with a wink, heading over to the bookshelf to retrieve the cameras we had set up that morning. Once everything was sorted, we jumped back in my car to head to the bar so Lou could retrieve his car. But when we arrived, he surprised me by insisting I follow him home. Edie has a big dinner waiting, buddy. If you don't come, she'll be really upset. I had planned to be alone, but Lou wouldn't take no for an answer, so I reluctantly followed him. When we walked in, Edie greeted me warmly, wrapping me in a hug and brushing her lips against my cheek. I couldn't tell if it was kindness or sympathy, but I appreciated it either way. Dinner was nice, I'm sure, but I barely remember it. Honestly, I just picked at my food while Lou and Edie exchanged worried glances. After dinner, they led me into their den, and Lou opened another bottle of wine. We sat around talking until Edie finally spoke up. I'm so angry and disappointed with Carol, she said, her voice tense. She always seemed so caring. When did she become so selfish? She thinks she can do whatever she wants now that she's successful. Please do whatever you can to support Tom. I don't like to choose sides during a divorce, but this feels different. Carol has gone too far, and we need to help Tom keep his daughter. She turned to Lou with intensity. And if one of those flashy models or TV people you work with approaches you, you'd better say no, or I might have to step in. Lou and I chuckled at Edie's words, but I had a feeling she meant it. We kept talking and sipping wine late into the night until I finally collapsed on their sofa. I faintly remember Edie covering me with a blanket and gently patting my arm. The next thing I knew, morning light filtered through the window, and my mouth felt dry. Lou lent me a toothbrush and razor, and I did my best to freshen up. By the time I was done, Edie had cooked a big breakfast. I sat down with them, and my appetite was a bit better. I guess I was starting to feel okay again. When I finished eating and thanked them for their kindness, Lou took my arm. Tom, let me handle everything. I have a lot to do this weekend, and you just need to focus on getting Susan and leaving. I'll keep you updated along the way. Lou, I don't know what I would have done without you, I said earnestly. I gave him an awkward hug and then headed home. But there was still one more thing I had to do, and I wasn't looking forward to it. When I got home, I found our address book to get Ted and Missy Stevenson's phone number. When I called, Missy answered. "Hi, Missy. It's Tom Bailey, Carol's husband. Can I come over to talk?" "Oh, hi Tom. Yes, that would be fine. Come on by." I could hear hesitation in her voice. We weren't close, and I knew she was curious about why I wanted to see her. She'd find out soon enough, I thought grimly, as I drove to her house, trying to plan what to say. It's never easy to tell someone their partner is unfaithful. I didn't know Missy well, which made the situation even more uncomfortable, but I felt I couldn't let her hear the news without some kind of warning. Missy had gone to college with Carol and me, she had even been in the same sorority. She was nice enough, but being 2 years younger meant we didn't interact much. I was surprised when I learned she married Ted, she didn't seem to fit his style. Still, we had chatted a few times at events, but Carol and I hadn't really spent any significant time with them unless Carol and Ted were around. When I arrived at Missy's house, she welcomed me with a warm smile and offered me something to drink. "Just a glass of ice water, please," I replied, worrying my mouth would be too dry when I delivered my news. After she brought me a glass, I took a quick sip and prepared to speak. "Missy, do you know where Ted is?" I asked, bracing myself. "Sure," she replied. "He went to a broadcasters convention. He'll be gone all week." "Why do you ask?" Taking a deep breath, I delivered the news I dreaded. "Missy, I'm sorry to say this, but Ted isn't at a convention. I found out that he and my wife have been together. They went away for some time together at the coast." Missy stared at me, shock washing over her face. "That can't be true," she said, her voice trembling. "I just saw him yesterday." I could tell she was struggling to process what I had just revealed. "He loves me. He wouldn't do that. Carol was like a sister to me. She wouldn't hurt me." Finally, she just looked at me with disbelief. "Oh, Tom, are you sure?" With a heavy heart, I pulled out my phone and played the video I had recorded. As she watched what they were doing, her eyes filled with tears. I sat next to her, putting my arm around her shoulders and rubbing her back gently. "I know, Missy. I know." Suddenly, she glared at me. "That woman took him from me," she shouted, her anger bubbling over. "If you had kept her in check." But then she stopped when she saw how hurt I was. "Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry. You've lost your wife too, haven't you?" Her words stung, and my own sadness surged back to the forefront. We held each other for a moment, seeking solace in our shared pain. After a while, we let go. Missy grabbed a napkin to wipe her face and then asked, "What will you do now?" I felt compelled to share the difficult situation Carol had put me in, especially concerning our daughter, Susan. Missy, who didn't have kids, quickly understood the tough position I was in and squeezed my hand. "Oh, Tom, I never thought she could be so unkind," she said softly. "What are you going to do?" "I will definitely file for divorce," I replied. "But I also need to take other steps to protect my daughter. It's probably better not to mention those things in case someone asks later." "You aren't going to do anything illegal, are you?" she exclaimed. "No," I reassured her, "but if it works out, both she and Ted will regret their choices." I tried to smile at her to ease her worries, but I wasn't sure it worked. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you think you two can fix things?" "After what you just showed me," she said, shaking her head. "After knowing this has been going on for so long, there's no way I could stay with him." "In that case, you might want to use the lawyer I contacted, unless you already have someone you trust," I suggested. She gave me a weak smile. "I don't know anyone to call. I didn't plan on needing a lawyer." "If you use my lawyer, it might save you some money." He already has all the evidence I gathered. I handed her a note with my lawyer's details. If you contact him on Monday and tell him we're working together, he can handle your paperwork at the same time as mine. She took the note and nodded. Tom, I need to ask you a big favor. What is it? She asked, looking concerned. I just need you to keep this to yourself. Don't tell anyone, not even close friends or family, until you hear from me. I looked at her earnestly. If you say anything, it could hurt my chances of keeping Susan. She nodded, looking serious. I won't say anything, Tom. It will be tough to pretend things are normal, but I promise. I thanked her, stood up, and started to leave. What are you going to do now, Tom? She asked. I gave her a grim smile and said, I'm going to get my daughter and take her out of town until things settle down. She wished me luck, and I returned the sentiment. We'll both need it, I thought. Next, I drove to Mrs. Alsop's house. When I arrived, Susan must have known I was coming because she met me at the door with a bright smile. Did you have a good time, sweetheart? I asked her. Oh yes, Daddy. I had a sleepover, and we had pancakes for breakfast. Then I played with dolls. Holding Susan close, I thanked Mrs. Alsop for watching her and reminded her that Susan wouldn't be coming over the next week. Mrs. Alsop looked at me closely and asked, Is everything okay, Tom? I glanced at Susan and then back at Mrs. Alsop. I hope so, I replied softly. She nodded and gave Susan a gentle farewell. You take good care of that little one. She's like family to me. And Tom, I'll keep you in my thoughts. Thank you, Mrs. Alsop. That means a lot. With that, I carried Susan to the car and strapped her into the back seat. When we got home, Susan started looking for her mom. Where's Mommy? She asked when she couldn't find her. I felt a lump in my throat as I replied, Mommy had to go somewhere for a while. But guess what? You and I are going on a trip too. Where are we going, Daddy? She asked, her face lighting up with excitement. We're going to visit Grandma and Grandpa on the farm, I told her. She squealed with delight and danced around. Susan loved my parents and enjoyed seeing the animals on their small farm in Alabama. Can we see the ducks and the baby pigs? She asked eagerly. Of course, honey, I replied, and the sooner we start, the sooner we can see them. I grabbed the bag I had packed for her along with my own suitcase, and we headed back out to the car. For a brief moment, I considered leaving a note for Carol to let her know where we would be, but I quickly decided against it. She hadn't thought about me much lately, why should I think about her? The drive took a little over an hour, and as we cruised along the road, I couldn't help but feel a mix of sadness and relief. We were leaving behind the chaos for a while, and I hoped that time away would give me the clarity I needed. As I drove to my parents' farm, the familiar landscape of rolling hills and open fields wrapped me in a wave of nostalgia. Susan slept through most of the drive, her little head resting against the window, but when we turned onto the gravel driveway, she stirred awake. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she pointed at the horses and cows grazing outside. When we parked next to the house, Mom and Dad rushed out to greet us. As I unbuckled Susan from her car seat, she dashed into her grandma's arms, bubbling with excitement and asking to see the farm animals. Mom smiled warmly, taking her hand and leading her toward the barn while casting a concerned glance back at me. I grabbed my bag, and Dad took Susan's, and we went inside to drop them off in my old room. The walls were still painted the same cheerful yellow, filled with memories of my childhood. Once we were settled, Dad led me to the kitchen and poured me a glass of fruit tea. The sweetness of the drink washed over me, bringing back memories of family gatherings and warm summer days. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Okay, Tom, what's going on with you and Carol? Dad asked, cutting straight to the chase. He wasn't one for small talk, and the worry etched on his face was hard to miss. Let's take a walk, Dad. I'll fill you in, I replied, feeling the knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I had been dreading this conversation since I called them to ask if we could stay for a week. They loved Carol, they thought of her as the daughter they never had. I feared how they would react. As we walked along the fence, I began to share the whole story. Dad listened quietly at first, but I could see the pain in his eyes as he processed my words. Several times, his expression changed as I revealed parts of what had happened. By the time I finished, tears glimmered in his eyes. I can't believe Carol would do something like this. She was always so kind to us and such a good mom to Susan. How could she change so much? He looked at me closely. You know I believe you, Tom, but is there any chance this is a misunderstanding? Or maybe a joke? I understood his struggle to accept the situation. If I were in his shoes, I would have the same doubts. Honestly, I was having a hard time believing it myself. I took out my phone and showed him the video I had recorded. Watch this, Dad, I said, pressing play. As the video played, I could see his face contort with shock. I can't see much of what's, oh my. His voice trailed off as the realization sank in. After he finished watching, he looked drained, shoulders slumping as he pulled me into a tight hug. Oh, son, I'm so sorry. This hurts me to see, and I can't imagine how you feel. We stood there for a few minutes, enveloped in a heavy silence before walking back to the house, his arm around my shoulder the whole way. When we reached the house, I turned to him and said, Dad, can you tell Mom? I don't think I can. He nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of my request. Mom and Susan were in the kitchen, enjoying a snack when we returned. The moment Mom saw Dad's face, her expression shifted to worry. She opened her mouth to speak, but Dad raised his hand to stop her. Son, he said, why don't you take Susan to the pond to see the baby ducks? Susan sprang to her feet, tugging at my arm. Let's go see the ducks, Daddy. Can we go? I nodded to Dad and led Susan away toward the pond, grateful for the distraction. When we returned to the house, I noticed Mom had been crying. She quickly wiped her eyes with a dish towel as we walked in and enveloped me in a tight hug. I love you, Tom. Your dad and I are here for you, no matter what. Thanks, Mom, I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. I looked at Dad and added, thanks, Dad. That really means a lot. We stood together in that moment, the three of us, when the silence began to confuse Susan. She didn't understand why the atmosphere felt so heavy, so I turned to her and said, okay, Susan, let's go unpack, then we can get ready for dinner. Her face lit up, and she grabbed my hand, skipping back to our room. In that moment, I made a promise to myself, I would never lose my daughter, no matter what. The next day was Sunday, and we all went to the old Baptist church that my parents had attended for years. I hadn't been in a long time, but it felt good to be there, surrounded by familiar faces, hearing the comforting words of the sermon, and singing the old hymns that resonated deep within me. That evening, I got a call from Lou. He filled me in on everything he had done over the weekend, and as I listened, I felt a surge of gratitude for having a friend like him. I knew I would be thankful for his support for a long time. I really appreciate everything you've done for me, Lou, I said, though my words came out awkwardly, as they often did with men. Lou waved it off, saying, you'd do the same for me. Then, his tone shifted. Okay, Tom, it's been lighthearted so far. Are you ready to take the next step? Once we start, we can't go back. I hesitated, thinking about the leap we were about to take. There was no guarantee it would work out. Even if we succeeded, it could lead to more trouble for me. If things went wrong, I could end up back on my parents' farm. But as I reflected on everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks, I realized that, through no fault of my own, Carol had put me in a position I couldn't handle. Even if I decided to follow her wishes, there was no assurance that things wouldn't blow up again. How would Susan see me as she grew up? I didn't want to be the kind of dad who set a bad example. No, I thought. Carol had put me in a difficult spot, and now I had to stand my ground. And by all means, that's what I will do, I said firmly. Lou, let's do this. I think he understood my resolve because he stayed quiet as I sat there. When I finally said I was ready, he replied, "For what it's worth, Edie thinks you're making the right choice." That gave me a little boost. He turned serious. "Do you have access to a computer?" I chuckled. My folks might live on a farm, but they're not stuck in the past. Okay, then. I'll call you tomorrow with details. Why not just email me the link? I asked, wanting to stay in the loop. No, he said. I don't want anything traceable. Just wait for my call. After that, we said our goodbyes, and I went to check on Susan, ensuring she was sound asleep in her new bed. Watching over her was my most important task now. Lou called me mid-morning on Monday. When you have some private time on the computer, go to YouTube and search for Watch It, and then call me back to share your thoughts, Lou had said, his voice tinged with excitement. Mom and Dad had taken Susan for a walk, creating the perfect opportunity for me to dive into the video he had mentioned. I sat down at my computer, browsed the website, and quickly sifted through a sea of videos. One in particular caught my eye. WXY News co-anchor Carol Martin shares her views on love and marriage. I clicked on it, and the familiar theme music of the 6 o'clock news filled the room. The opening scene played out as it always did, but then the camera zoomed in on Carol, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her voice faded as the narration began. Recently, popular news co-anchor Carol Martin from WXY shared her thoughts on love and marriage. The screen shifted, and I heard her familiar voice. Marriage has been around for ages, but today it faces challenges like never before. I recognized those words. They were part of a previous series WXY had done on rising divorce rates across the country. Instead of continuing that theme, the narrator prompted a more direct question: "What do you think about the importance of marriage, Carol?" Suddenly, the scene changed to our living room, and I heard her say, "Wedding vows were written in a different time. No one believes those words anymore." The screen froze, and the narrator's voice came back, asking about commitment to one's partner. Carol's response made my heart sink. "If I want to be with Ted Stevenson, I will. It's what I want." The screen displayed a still image of Ted Stevenson, clearly identifying who she was referring to. The announcer pressed on, "What do you think the community would say? Do you think most people in Birmingham watching your news would agree with you?" "I don't care what my viewers think," Carol replied defiantly. "They're just a bunch of simple folks." The announcer, taken aback, interjected, "That's certainly a bold opinion. Aren't you worried about how it might change public perception?" Carol's response was dismissive. "In 6 months to a year, I'll leave this small town for a real city where life is happening. How people think here means nothing to me." The narrator continued, "So, you plan to pursue a relationship with Ted Stevenson?" Carol's answer was clear and unwavering. "I've already said I'm going to be with Ted, and there's nothing anyone can do about it." In that moment, my phone screen displayed another scene, revealing Carol more clearly alongside Ted. The video paused once again as the narrator's voice returned. Now, the lingering question for Birmingham viewers is, where are Carol and Ted this week? The WXY News theme played once more as the screen faded to black, and the video ended. I leaned back in my chair, feeling an unsettling mix of victory and sorrow wash over me. My fingers shook as I picked up my cell phone and called Lou. He recognized my number immediately and answered eagerly, "What did you think?" "Oh my gosh, Lou. This is incredible. This video is going to impact her career big time." "Pretty good, huh?" he replied, pride evident in his voice. As I reflected on what I had just watched, a wave of guilt washed over me. "Do you think we were too harsh on her?" "Listen," he said firmly, Didn't she say all of those things to you? Yes, but... No buts, he interrupted. She's become quite the self-centered person, and we need to show everyone what she's really like. He softened his tone, speaking with more empathy. Tom, you're a good person. I know you'd rather take the hurt yourself than cause someone else to hurt. But if you don't do this, Susan is the one who will pay the price. She'll have Carol as her example. You don't want that for her, do you? I took a deep breath, the weight of Lou's words settling heavily on my chest. You're right, Lou. I really don't see another choice. Thanks for helping me stay focused. Now, what should we do next? I asked. Should we send out mass emails with a link to the video? The great thing about a viral moment is that it spreads on its own, he said, excitement bubbling in his voice. Once there's something to catch on to, like a flu bug, this video will take off. I might mention it to a couple of people who love to chat, but after that, it'll grow from there. Just be patient. That sounds good, Lou. You're the expert here. Just keep me in the loop for the next few days. The following week at the farm with Mom and Dad was a delightful distraction. Susan had visited the farm before, but only briefly. With a full week ahead, Dad and I were eager to show her how a real farm operates and where our food comes from. Meanwhile, Mom took Susan into the kitchen to teach her about cooking from scratch, a skill she was eager to learn. Susan loved helping, standing on a stool to add ingredients and mix them in big bowls, laughing as flour dusted her little hands. Overall, it was a lovely week filled with experiences that Susan wouldn't have had in the city. Meanwhile, Lou called daily to keep me updated on the situation surrounding the video. Guess what? He laughed on Tuesday. Eddie heard about the video from a coworker. By Wednesday, the video had become the hot topic at Lou's weekly group meeting. He assured me he hadn't mentioned it himself. Then, on Thursday, the local newspaper included a short mention of the video in its media column, ending with the tantalizing question, "Where are Carol and Ted?" It sent ripples of speculation throughout Birmingham. When Lou called me on Thursday afternoon, his voice brimmed with excitement. I talked to our contact at the TV station. They're in a panic. Other news outlets are calling for interviews with Carol and Ted about that video, and the station doesn't know how to respond. Apparently, Don Sanchez took some time off this week, and they can't find him. On Friday, Lou pointed me to a write-up on a media blog discussing the buzz in Birmingham regarding the two anchors. They even included a link to the YouTube video and hinted that consequences might follow. That morning, I called my lawyer and instructed him to start the divorce process. I also arranged for Carol to be served on Saturday at the beach, knowing that it would add salt to the wounds of our already fractured family. As I hung up the phone, I felt a surge of determination. I needed to take control of my life, for Susan's sake and my own. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back now. Carol and Ted were spending time together, and while it would cost a bit more than I had initially planned, I thought it was worth it. I believed this was the right move, especially knowing what Lou was planning next. I also informed Missy about my decision to file for divorce and asked if she wanted to serve Ted at the same time. No, she replied calmly. I want to do that myself when he finally comes home. I wished her good luck, knowing that she would need it. The other local TV stations were envious of Wazai's success and quickly jumped on the gossip early in the week. They saw an opportunity when they looked up the video online. Their challenge was how to cover the story effectively. Lou helped them by giving a tip to a producer at the second-best station about my divorce plans. This was actual news they could report, rather than just speculation. Then my attorney added fuel to the fire when a reporter called to check on the filing. My lawyer let her know that the papers would be served on Saturday, revealing where that would happen. Suddenly, the hunt was on. The news director realized this story was too juicy to ignore and decided to go all out, coordinating with the process server to ensure everything lined up for Saturday. Lou called me that Saturday morning with even more news. Don Sanchez has been reached, he said. He's cutting his trip short to get back to Birmingham quickly. My contact at Vzais informed me that everyone at the station was on edge, they had no idea what was coming next. Lou also reminded me to tune into the evening news on the rival station. You might find it interesting, he said with a hint of irony. Saturdays are usually slow news days, so TV stations often scramble for content. That Saturday, the story about Carol and Ted became the main feature. The rival anchor, slick and polished, presented with a photo of Carol and Ted behind him, a snapshot of a billboard I had seen from my office just a week ago. All week, many people in Birmingham have been asking, where are Carol Martin and Ted Stevenson? The anchor began. Today, we found them in Gulf Shores, where they've been out of sight for days. The scene changed to a video clip of Hilda O'Reilly, the station's main reporter, as she strolled along the beach toward a couple relaxing in the sand. It was Carol and Ted, completely oblivious to her presence or the camera crew until Hilda reached them and asked loudly, Carol Martin. Ted Stevenson. What do you want to say about your relationship and the rumors swirling back in Birmingham? Carol turned in surprise, realizing who was speaking to her. She quickly adjusted her clothing as the camera caught her shocked expression. Hilda, what are you doing here? Why are you bothering us? She snapped, her voice shaky but defiant. Hilda remained calm, pressing on with her questions. What do you have to say about the video that's been shared online? What video? Carol asked, her confusion palpable. The one where you said you were coming here to be with Ted Stevenson, Hilda replied coolly. Carol began to stammer, and Ted tried to change the subject, but just then, a man in a suit approached them, and everyone paused. He walked right up to Carol, his voice booming. Are you Carol Bailey Martin? Yes, Carol replied hesitantly. Then, Miss Martin, he said, handing her an envelope, you have been served. Your husband has changed the locks on your home, and you are no longer welcome there. With that, he turned and walked away calmly. For a moment, Carol stood in shock, but then frustration overtook her. That man, she shouted, her voice laced with indignation. Ted recognized that the cameras were still rolling and gently pulled Carol away, advising her in a low voice to remain composed. He guided her toward the resort, the camera following them as they walked off, visibly displeased. Back in the studio, the announcer said, so there you have it. Carol Martin and Ted Stevenson, who have been missing this week, were found at a resort in Gulf Shores. In a surprising twist, Carol's husband has filed for divorce and has asked her to leave their home. We tried to reach him for a comment but were unable to do so. I was unreachable at the moment, staying at my parents' farm with Susan to avoid reporters. My only source of information was Lou. He found out from someone at another Birmingham station that Carol had thought the server was joking when he informed her about the locks, so she asked Ted to take her to my house. That was a big mistake. Not only was her key useless, but a camera crew was waiting at the house, capturing her growing frustration. Things only worsened for Carol. After leaving my house, she and Ted went to his place, but his ex-wife Missy was waiting at the door with her own divorce papers. Cameras surrounded them as Ted found himself in an awkward situation. In a panic, they drove off, trying to evade the reporters, ultimately spending the night at a motel on their way to Tennessee. For more updates, Lou relied on our media manager, who had the scoop from his contact at Vzais. On Saturday afternoon, Don Sanchez, the news director at Vzais, returned to Birmingham and attempted to reach Carol and Ted, but to no avail. They were still on their trip, with their phones switched off to avoid calls from reporters. Don couldn't even leave a message because both their voicemail boxes were full, which only worsened his mood. His frustration grew when someone showed him a clip from the rival station covering the news. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that Ted finally thought to check in at the office. Don then ordered Carol and Ted to come to the studio right away. They jumped into Ted's car and drove to Vzais, unaware of the storm that was brewing back home. When they arrived at the station, they were met with the overwhelming glare of cameras and reporters eager to capture every detail of their unraveling story. The rivals' broadcast van was parked right out front, a stark reminder of the drama unfolding. Carol and Ted exchanged nervous glances before they decided to sneak in through a service entrance at the back of the building. This way, they could avoid the prying eyes of the media and make their way directly into the meeting room where Don was already addressing the staff. As soon as they stepped inside, the atmosphere grew tense. Don's expression was serious as he began to scold them for their reckless actions. Carol and Ted tried to explain themselves, but their words were drowned out by Don's mounting frustration. Finally, he reached his limit and announced in front of everyone that Carol and Ted were no longer part of the team. "What?" Carol exclaimed, disbelief etched on her face. "You can't do that. We have a contract." Don shifted his tone, taking on a serious demeanor. "If you check those contracts, you'll see they include a morals clause that requires you to act in accordance with community standards. What we do in private is nobody else's business," Carol countered defiantly. Don, a devout Catholic, stood up and leaned over his desk. This morning at Mass, the priest spoke about the importance of marriage and the consequences of not upholding those commitments. He didn't name you two, but he discussed the poor examples set by some public figures in our city. Carol was visibly shocked, horrified at the thought of being mentioned in local sermons. Meanwhile, Ted, still simmering with anger, interjected, "But no one knows about us or even cares." "Clearly, you didn't see the news last night," Don replied, his voice steady. "I suggest you watch it. But you don't even need to wait for that. Just look out the window." He walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain. Across the street, a billboard featuring the well-known co-anchors stood tall. Carol's eyes widened as she glanced at the sign and gasped. Someone had spray-painted it, altering the message to read, "Birmingham's choice for the 6 o'clock news." Don let the curtain drop and turned back to the now quiet pair. In a formal tone, he stated, "Your actions have brought shame to this station and harmed our reputation. I must relieve you of your duties and terminate your contracts immediately." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Have you ever seen the original Frankenstein?" Confused, they both nodded. "Well," Don continued, "right now, you are the monster, and the people of Birmingham are the angry mob. If I were you, I'd leave town quickly." As I drove back to Birmingham with Susan on Sunday evening, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I had deliberately left late to avoid any encounters with Carol or the media. The moment I turned on the TV, I heard the news about Carol and Ted losing their jobs. Upon arriving at our garage, I noticed that the other news teams had decided to move on, likely chasing the next big story. The following morning, I caught another break when the Birmingham News led with a new scandal involving a city politician misusing public funds. That story pushed Carol and Ted's troubles to the back pages, redirecting the reporters' focus elsewhere. I took Susan to Mrs. Alsop's house that morning. When we arrived, Mrs. Alsop welcomed us warmly and hugged Susan tightly. "Go on in, honey," she said. "My kids have missed you, they want to play." Once Susan ran off with her friends, Mrs. Alsop turned to me, concern evident in her eyes. "I'm so sorry to hear about everything that's happened, Tom. I hope you and Susan will be okay." I thanked her, but the words felt hollow. I didn't know how to address her concern about our uncertain future. I noticed she hadn't mentioned Carol at all, a quiet relief amidst my turmoil. When I got to the office, everyone greeted me with friendly smiles, but I could sense they were trying to keep their distance. It felt as if I had an illness, and no one knew how to react. Lou, however, greeted me warmly, and I appreciated the gesture. "You're a genius," I told him. "You really nailed the viral campaign." "Well," he replied with a hint of pride, "it worked better than we expected. The only downside is we can never tell anyone how we did it." "That's probably for the best," I agreed. "I know this is going to come back to me, and I'm ready for it. By now, Carol must have figured out that I was the source of that video, and I braced myself for her reaction. As it turned out, my worries were unnecessary. Later that week, my attorney called with surprising news: Carol had chosen not to fight the divorce. But why? I asked, bewildered. She said she wouldn't go easy on me. I spoke with her lawyer, he explained. Carol wanted to file a countersuit for divorce and invasion of privacy, but her attorney convinced her otherwise. There were questions about the legality of recording a conversation with a spouse, especially since one is a public figure. Her case could end up in the highest courts before it's resolved. Plus, her lawyer reminded her that she isn't a popular figure right now and would struggle to find a jury sympathetic to her. What about Susan? I pressed, the thought weighing heavily on me. Carol swore she would try to take her from me. My attorney chuckled lightly. Tom, your soon-to-be ex-wife is out of work. Her chances of getting back into broadcasting in Birmingham, or anywhere in Alabama, are very slim after all this attention. She's now seen in a less favorable light, with a bad reputation and no stable job. Who would give custody of a young child to her? Is she really leaving town? I asked, my heart sinking. Yes, as fast as she can. When she sells the house, you'll have to share the money, which could happen any time before Susan turns 18. Carol will also get to see Susan on holidays and birthdays, but she's giving up custody because she doesn't believe she can have anything else. She only wants to collect her things from the house before she goes, and she wants to talk to you when she comes over. If she'll agree to that, then I can meet with her before she leaves, I said, a flicker of hope igniting in my chest. We decided to talk at the end of the week, and just like that, things were arranged. I had what I wanted, well, not really. What I truly wanted was to have my life and family back as they were before this whole mess started, but that felt like a distant dream now. Once trouble starts, it's hard to make it stop. At least I had my daughter, and that was something worth fighting for. My daughter was what mattered most to me, and that thought kept me grounded through everything that had happened. The following night, I sat down for dinner with Lou and Eddie. Susan was with us too, peacefully asleep in one of their beds while the adults chatted. It wasn't a party, more like a moment to reflect on everything that had unfolded recently. I had brought a bottle of the best sparkling drink I could find to thank my friends for their unwavering support. Guys, Eddie said, raising her glass, when I first heard about your plan, I wasn't sure it was going to work out. I worried it might lead to more challenges, but I kept quiet because. She pointed at me, you're fighting for your daughter, and you, she continued, looking at Lou, believed you could make it succeed. So cheers to both of you for standing strong when it mattered. Cheers. Lou and I replied in unison, clinking our glasses together. As we savored the moment, I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was one more thing I needed to do, check on Missy Stevenson. She was an innocent bystander caught in the whirlwind of this situation, and I felt awful for putting her in such a tough position. She had never expected any of this. I picked up my phone and called her, and to my relief, she invited me for lunch, which made me think she wasn't too upset with me. We met at a quiet little restaurant, the kind where soft music played in the background and the dim lighting created a cozy atmosphere. After we ordered, I looked at her and asked, "How are you holding up?" "Not well, I'm afraid, Tom," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I still can't believe everything that's happened. One day, I was happily married to a successful man, and the next, I'm dealing with a divorce from someone who let me down." "I understand," I said softly, trying to offer some comfort. "It's all so hard to believe. It feels like a bad TV show." Missy nodded, her eyes misty. She then asked about Carol and me, and I shared the news of our divorce. "Good," she said, her tone resolute. "She's facing the consequences of her actions. What about Ted?" "That coward," she spat. "He didn't even have the decency to talk to me. He just left town and told his lawyer to handle everything. I don't know where he went, and honestly, I don't care. But sometimes I wake up reaching for him, forgetting what happened. She took out a tissue and wiped her eyes. Are you going to be okay financially? I asked, genuinely concerned. Kind of, she said, sighing heavily. He left me the house, but it's too big for me now. We have a large mortgage and no real savings, so I don't think I can keep it. He's supposed to pay me support, but honestly, I'm not counting on it. He needs to find a job first, which my friends say will be hard for him. Missy looked down at her hands, her sadness palpable. I think the best thing for me is to move back in with my parents for a while, look for a job, and start over. I felt a deep sense of sympathy for her. She was a nice person who didn't deserve this. You can always keep in touch and let me know what happens next, I encouraged her. I genuinely liked Missy and hoped she would find some happiness again. As I left the restaurant, I couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in my stomach about my upcoming visit with Carol. A lot of my anger had faded since our successful video campaign, and I felt more like myself again. I didn't want to argue with her or bring up past grievances. Instead, I decided to do something thoughtful. I planned to have Susan with me when Carol arrived. When Carol pulled up in her rented SUV, I noticed the frown on her face. But as soon as I opened the door and Susan ran to her, Carol's expression transformed. Her face lit up with joy and tears as Susan hugged her tightly. Carol looked back at me, silently conveying her gratitude. They came inside, and Carol spent some time playing with Susan. What was meant to be a short visit quickly turned into a longer one as I lost track of time. After Susan shared all her stories and the things she wanted to show her mom, Carol suggested, "Let's go upstairs to play. I'll be up soon, sweetheart. Your dad and I need to talk first." Once Susan left, Carol looked at me, annoyance creeping into her voice. "Thanks for letting me see her. I didn't expect that." I nodded, but Carol's expression shifted dramatically. "I can't believe you did this to me. You took our private talk and made me look foolish in front of everyone. How could you do that?" I sighed, trying to remain calm. "Carol, I don't want to fight. There's no point in it for either of us." "That's easy for you to say," she shot back sharply. "You've taken my job, my family, and my future, all to save your pride." "Carol, I meant what I said," I replied, my voice steady. "I want you to think about this. Nothing would have happened if you hadn't acted on your own wants without caring about others. All of this is because of your choices." Carol opened her mouth to respond, but just then, Susan called out from upstairs, asking when she could come back down. Carol shot me one last glare before heading up to see her daughter. After spending some time playing, Carol moved Susan to our bedroom to pack while still chatting with her. I could hear their laughter from downstairs, but it felt bittersweet. Finally, Carol came back down with her suitcases, and Susan followed closely behind. Carol knelt in front of Susan, holding her shoulders gently. "Mommy has to go now. I'll be living far away, and I won't see you every day. But I promise to visit as much as I can, and we can talk on the phone and video chat whenever you want." Susan's response was swift and heartfelt. "No, Mommy, please don't go." She jumped into her mother's arms, squeezing her tightly. Carol held her close, gently stroking her back and whispering comforting words. "It's okay, sweetie. I'll see you soon, and we'll have lots of fun together." As she spoke, Carol walked over to me and handed Susan to me. "Be a good girl and listen to Daddy. I love you, Susan. Don't forget that." Then she picked up her bags and quickly headed for the door. I noticed tears rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't look back. Instead, she walked straight to her car, loaded her bags, and drove away. After a quick wave, I held my crying daughter close, realizing I was also shedding tears for my own loss. My little girl was losing her mother, and I was losing my wife. After a moment, I gently set Susan down. "I have an idea," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "What is it, Daddy?" she asked, still teary-eyed. "How about we go to the park to see if the ducks are there? After that, we can find the ice cream truck and get some ice cream. Does that sound good?" "Oh yes," she exclaimed, her eyes brightening at the thought. With a smile, I took her hand, knowing we could still create happy memories even amidst our sadness. "Can we feed the ducks, Daddy?" Susan exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "Absolutely," I replied, feeling a wave of relief wash over me as I saw her smile again. I knew there would be moments when she would miss her mom and the comforting presence of a woman in our home, but I hoped the saying was true: young children bounce back from change faster than adults. I just needed to adapt, too. The following week brought unexpected challenges. One late afternoon, the head of the agency called me into his office. "Tom," he began, his tone serious. "You've done great work for us, and we really appreciate everything you've contributed." I braced myself for the but that I feared was coming. "However, the situation with your wife has made things complicated. Clients are asking about you, and it's affecting our relationships, especially with WXY, which is crucial for us." "Are you letting me go?" I asked bluntly, my annoyance bubbling beneath the surface. I didn't want a lengthy explanation, I just wanted the truth. "Not at all," he replied firmly. "But some of the executives believe it would be better for both you and the agency if you started looking for a job elsewhere." "How much time do I have?" I responded a bit sharply, feeling cornered. "There's no pressure," he reassured me. "Take your time, and I'll be happy to give you a positive reference to help with your job search." I didn't agree with the decision, it felt unfair. Still, I knew better than to burn any bridges, so I shook his hand, expressed my understanding, and thanked him for the offer of a recommendation before heading back to my office. On my way, I stepped into Lou's office and closed the door behind me. "What's going on?" he asked, concern etched across his face. "I just found out I might need to find a new job," I told him. "It seems the situation has made things tough for the higher-ups." "This isn't right," he said, determination in his voice. "I'm going to speak to him and share my thoughts. They can't treat you like this, especially after everything you've been through." I held his shoulders, guiding him back to his chair. "You need to stay calm. I don't enjoy being pushed aside, but I knew there were risks when I started this. I won't let you get hurt, you've already done so much for me." He looked upset but began to relax as I talked him down. We ended our conversation with me promising to come for dinner on Saturday. I jokingly asked if I could bring a guest, and he was surprised until I explained that my guest was 4 years old. After that, I returned to my office and started updating my resume. As I worked, I couldn't help but reflect on how I wasn't the only one who ended up in a tough spot. I had made connections at other agencies in the Birmingham area, so I began calling them. However, after speaking with several people, it became clear that because of the situation with Carol and Ted, I wasn't in a good position. Everyone liked me personally, but no one wanted to take a chance on me. I realized I needed to look elsewhere. Finally, I decided to return to my old agency in Mobile. It was far enough away from the previous issues, and they were happy to have someone with my experience. But that meant I had to sell my house in Birmingham. Even though the market was decent, I didn't get much from the sale, especially since I had to share what I did get with Carol. Carol didn't just vanish from our lives, she began contacting Susan every week and eventually switched to video calls so they could see each other. They both wanted more than just online chats, but in-person visits were impossible since Carol had moved to California. It seemed our video calls had a bigger impact than we thought. During job interviews, I was often questioned about what had happened, even outside of our area. Carol kept searching for opportunities farther west but couldn't escape her past. Eventually, she decided to pause her dreams of a broadcasting career and took a teaching job in broadcast journalism at Santa Ana College in California. It wasn't as thrilling or well paid as her previous position, but she felt relieved to be back in a familiar field. When I reconnected with my old agency in Mobile, my next task was to find a place to live. My new employer introduced me to a real estate agency, and they sent a new agent, Marilyn Elliott, to help me look at homes. I was supposed to meet her at the first house, and as I parked my car, I noticed she was already at the door. Something about her seemed familiar, even though the name Marilyn Elliott didn't ring a bell. As I got closer, I exclaimed, "Missy Stevenson." She smiled, her face lighting up with recognition. "What a nice surprise, Tom. When I saw your name, I thought it could be you, but I didn't expect it. Oh, and Marilyn Elliott is my maiden name. Everyone still calls me Missy." Missy had a list of homes to show me, and as we toured each one, we caught up on everything that had happened in the past few months. I learned that Missy's family lived in Mobile, and she had moved down after Ted left. It turned out her new career was in residential real estate. I shared my story, including my departure from the Birmingham agency and my move to Mobile. When I mentioned Susan and needing to find a preschool for her, Missy got excited. "I know some great places that would be perfect for her," she said enthusiastically. "I also have ideas for fun activities in the area. You'll have to introduce her to me." She seemed a bit shy, perhaps worried about being too forward, but I welcomed any help that would make Susan's transition smoother. I enjoyed our conversation, and as the day wrapped up, I found myself inviting Missy to dinner, not just to chat about the houses, of course. "Sure. I'd love that," she agreed readily, a bright smile on her face. As we parted ways, I felt a sense of hope stirring within me. Maybe, just maybe, this change wouldn't be so bad after all. A couple of years younger than us, I hadn't had much contact with Missy until recently. However, as I listened to her talk over dinner, I felt an unexpected spark of interest. She had always been pretty in a friendly, approachable way, but tonight I saw her in a new light, smart, engaging, and refreshingly straightforward. After being around so many polished television personalities, her genuine demeanor was like a breath of fresh air. As we chatted about real estate, she asked me which house I preferred. I listed a few that caught my eye, then turned the question back to her, expecting her to suggest the most expensive option. Instead, she pointed to a more modestly priced house and said, "Oh, that one, that's where I would want to live." Her honesty made her seem a bit shy, and I couldn't help but think, that could be nice. To sum it up, Missy and I ended up getting married, and yes, we did move into the house she liked. I was initially nervous about how Susan and Missy would get along, but my worries turned out to be completely unfounded. I learned that Missy had wanted to start a family since she married Ted, but he had been hesitant, thinking that children would slow him down. When Missy met Susan, it was like an instant connection. Susan clearly missed having a woman in her life, and when Missy began visiting us, Susan embraced her wholeheartedly. Even before we tied the knot, Susan began calling her mommy Missy, which soon shortened to just Missy. The summer after our wedding, I decided it was time to act on a thought I'd had for a while. The three of us planned a trip to Los Angeles so Susan could reunite with Carol. My plan was simple: Susan would spend the week with Carol while Missy and I explored the city as tourists. After a week filled with fun and adventure, we would all gather together and fly back to Mobile. I was apprehensive about discussing the trip with Missy. It's not every day that a second wife is thrilled about her husband reconnecting with his first wife, especially considering Missy had valid reasons to harbor hard feelings toward Carol. However, when I finally brought it up, I was surprised by her response. "That sounds great," she said. It seemed she was more comfortable with our history than I had imagined, and perhaps even more understanding of the past than I was. When we arrived at John Wayne Airport, Carol was waiting for us. Even though I had seen her picture many times, I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was cut short, and she was dressed elegantly. It was clear she had gone through a transformation. Susan appeared shy, clutching Missy's hand and hiding her face, but Missy gently encouraged her. "Go on, sweetie. It's okay to say hello to your mom. Finally, Susan let go, walked over to Carol, and quickly gained confidence, rushing into her arms for a tight hug. Carol's eyes glistened with tears as she embraced her daughter, while Susan looked a bit worried at first. "I'm just so happy to see you," Carol said softly, reassuring her. They held on tightly, and I could see the gratitude in Carol's eyes as she thanked Missy and me with a glance. It reminded me of the last time Carol had left Birmingham. This reunion felt different. As we made our way to the baggage claim together, Susan paused to look at some trinkets in a store window. Carol turned to us, her expression earnest. "I know we don't have much time, but I want to say I'm sorry to both of you. I've thought a lot about the past few years and even talked to someone who helped me realize how my actions affected others, especially you two. I know it might be hard to forgive me, but I hope you can at least try not to hold any negativity toward me." Missy and I exchanged glances, sensing the sincerity in Carol's words. We stepped forward to hug her, and it felt liberating to let go of some of those old feelings. After returning from our trip, I decided it was time to reach out to Birmingham. When Eddie answered, we chatted for a bit before I asked to speak to Lou. Once he got on the line, we exchanged friendly greetings, then I shared my idea. "Remember when you were willing to take a chance with me? Are you ready to do that again?" Lou sounded confused. "What are you talking about, Tom?" "I'm suggesting you quit your job, move down here, and help me start a new advertising agency called Bailey and Faraday Advertising Agency. What do you think?" Lou chuckled. "There's only one way I'd consider that." "And what's that?" I asked. "We'd have to change the name to Faraday and Bailey." We both laughed, and the excitement in our voices was palpable as we began planning. After his experiences at the old agency, Lou was ready for a change, and my call came at just the right moment. Once we got settled and mobile, Missy helped them find a lovely house nearby, even waiving her commission to make it easier for them. When Lou and I finally opened our agency, we pitched our services to a potential client who seemed genuinely interested. "I'm looking for something fresh to help us stand out. Maybe a viral campaign? Could you handle that?" he asked. Lou and I exchanged excited smiles. "Yes, we can handle that," I replied confidently. As we got the ball rolling on our new venture, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. With Missy, Susan, and Lou by my side, we were ready to take on whatever came next. Hey, listeners of Tempter's Cheating Tales. If you enjoyed this story and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for tuning in, and see you in the next wonderful story.